I'm always too busy like dancing with the intro now.
I'm still sharing it on the page, so even though it's given me a bit of extra time, it wasn't enough for someone with my technological skills.
That's fine.
Oh,
give you some time. Also give people time to realise we're here.
Yes, let's call it that. It's all for your benefit, this. And that's why I'm staring at the screen. My camera wouldn't have been seen when the funky music was playing, would it? Because I was
no.
Good.
I could see you, and I think you see me. Like I was dancing to the little intro tune as well.
Oh, I couldn't see that. I would have probably got more carried away.
It says play it again, Sam.
Well, you'd have to play it again, and then I just do the dancing.
And then you can do the dance. Hello, lovely people. Look, there's Amy, Roberta, Laurel. Lovely people.
I like SteamYard. I never thought I'd like being in a steamy yard, but
it's StreamYard.
Okay, sorry. That'd be why then. That makes more sense. I did wonder why it would be steamy.
Roberta thinks we need to see the dancing. It was really bad though, Roberta. It was literally, I was like this.
Okay. Well, speak for yourself. I mean, I thought I had some moves, but yeah, no, mine was mainly finger dancing as well. So, you know.
It kind of has to be finger dancing, doesn't it? Because you can't really see the rest of us. For the last year or so, I've literally just been from the waist up, like nothing else exists.
Yeah, I mean, I've literally worn shorts, and I think I did a few of these in pajama bottoms, like tracksuits. I don't know what life's going to be like if I have to go back to speaking to people live. I had to wear a shirt the other day for a live thing. So
yeah, but I was always that weird trainer, like or teacher that would take their shoes off and like bounce around anyway. So just do you.
Yeah.
As long as you're like, you know, not nude, it's fine.
Well, you can. There are beaches for that. You can do that there, I suppose. You could hold your thing nude.
I wouldn't. I'm called. Louis describes me as a almost never nude.
Almost never nude.
I don't know if anyone's seen. Oh no, what's the show called? Oh, Si wants to know what beach was that?
Which way to the beach, Sam? Oh, I know. I think what he wants me to do is say, it's that way. There you go. Oh. Which way to the beach?
Is that a new thing?
It's the gun show, yes. 2 tickets. There you go, Simon. But today, I just thought you could just teach me things. Learn me stuff.
I do like learning people stuff. It's fun.
Learn me some things. That was my first question, actually, Chloe. Is what's been interesting you recently? Anything in particular?
To be fair, it's always the same thing. I'm one of those autistic people whose dedicated interests don't tend to change. So I tend to feel, because of the stereotypes of like, you know, autistic people and experience, some autistic people don't realize they're autistic because they're like, but I don't have one dedicated interest, or if I do have interests, it's loads of them, and then I get bored of one and I move on to another. And so yeah, but I am one of those autistic people, like the stereotype, where my dedicated interests don't tend to change. So I suppose they might just get more nuanced. So it's been mental health and stigma. So mental health since I was about 17. And then more recently, and my PhD and whatnot, was mental health stigma reduction, and now autistic stigma reduction, I guess. But in the last year, my thing that I'm talking about all the time is the importance of autistic identity, culture, community, and space. Oh, and snails. I do love snails. Yes, my giant African land snails. But they don't take up anywhere near as much brain space as, trying to improve autistic people's well-being by helping them foster that positive identity, find the culture, community, and create spaces. So that's kind of my thing. That's my jam. Well, that's what I've been writing on and doing little videos on, and
awesome. I had a conversation with Tigger yesterday, and we were talking about a lot about sort of culture, and I guess creating a more positive, supportive culture for autistic identity. And I had a little idea that I thought you might like, which is rather than change the name from diagnosis to an opportunity to find your identity, maybe, or opportunity to find your neurotype, or something like that. So it's like a presented to children and young people as, oh, this is a chance to find out who, you know, not exactly who you are, but whether you've got a certain neurotype, whether you're neurotypical. Rather, as soon as you call it a diagnosis, medicalizes it as an illness, really,
Yeah.
then, isn't it? And
it's all very problematic as well, because it's a misnomer to call it a disorder, or I mean, it's not even classed as a disease. So seeing that is very problematic, because it's never been classed as a disease to be autistic. Well, autism in quotation marks. But even classing it as a disorder is a misnomer, because there's no evidence for disorder in the brain or anything like that. So even when we can see slight differences between autistic people and non-autistic people in neurology, or, you know, but at this point in time, there's no consistent pattern. So we can't go, oh, that's autism, that bit there, you know, there's none of that. So it's a misnomer at this point in time to call it disorder. So what's being called a disorder is behaviours that society doesn't at this point like or accept or embrace. And people really struggle with that. And I understand why. I did for a long time. So like I say, I mean, in terms of my personal, why I got so fascinated with mental health was because both my parents, and my dad was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young adult, and my mum was diagnosed with manic depression with psychosis when it was called that. And then obviously that gets updated to bipolar with psychosis. I think she's autistic with experiences of psychosis. And so I was always fascinated trying to understand them. And then when I went to university and started my psychology degree, I went in with the intention of trying to cure mental illnesses, and how would I go about that and things. And as I went through my degree, I realized I had it wrong. I realized that what we class as illness is actually not just, but it's reasonable distress responses, and we don't get to pick what our psychology does. That's just the luck, if you like, of the draw of multiple factors: genes, your psychology itself, environment. It's like very complicated. I've gone off on a weird tangent, but it's the same thing when we class, you know, anything relating to mental health. So when you see somebody and they're telling you that they're experiencing voice hearing, or, you know, seeing hallucinations and things like that, or feeling hallucinations, we take that as a sign of disorder, but there's still no indication of disorder in the body or the brain. Does that make sense? So it's just that society struggles with those experiences. So I feel the same way. Like you say, it's a misnomer to class autistic experience as disorder, because there's no evidence for that. It's just behaviours that people find difficult. So yeah, we always talk about, Annette and I have talked about it in this way for years, which is that we discuss it as our autistic discovery, because when both of us were diagnosed, but those, yeah, Annette, but both of those are diagnoses. They're classed as medical diagnoses, but there's nothing medical involved. It's all observation. It's all observation of behaviours or self-reporting of behaviours. So nobody found autism in my brain or my DNA or, you know, anything like that. So we talk about it more as our autistic discovery. And actually that discovery came before the diagnosis. It came from connecting with other autistic people or reading about it. So what's your phrase for it? What were you thinking?
Well, I'm going to change it now, because I think I prefer discovery. But yeah, like an opportunity. So an opportunity to discover your neurotype, I guess.
And this is the thing, I've written about it as well in, so there's a chapter, if it doesn't get edited out, coming out next year in the Handbook of Critical Autism Studies. And there I'm writing about identity, culture, community and space. And I talk towards the end about how that would or should impact diagnosis, because it should be more aligned with how people work out their sexuality, their gender. So, you know, homosexuality was in the diagnostic manuals as a mental illness in quotation marks until around the 70s, and then in there still in sneaky forms. But obviously it was removed for numerous reasons, but mostly because of the gay community, or the LGBTQ community, demanding that it be removed, because it didn't make sense. It was them working at, that's who they are. There's no disorder or illness there. So I feel that we should get to the same sort of point that, you discover your neurology and your autistic identity in that much more holistic, safe way than being diagnosed, because it's, and we've talked about this before, haven't we, that we all, relatively speaking, get diagnosed when we're distressed and struggling autistic people, and then particularly with young autistic people who don't necessarily understand the politics of it all, they connect that diagnosis with when they're struggling. So they make a connection that to be autistic is to be struggling and to not be doing well, and they don't have an understanding, and sometimes the families don't recognize it either, that when they're actually doing okay and the environment's good and they're thriving as autistic people, they're still autistic then as well. So they should blame the autism, quotation marks, when they're doing well, and recognize that. So we should all be able to find out we're autistic when we're not in a place of struggling. It shouldn't get to that point.
It's so important though, because I mean, we're, over the last couple of years, meeting people such as yourself who are, speaking out about the positive aspects of your identity. I work with so many young people that are understandably they don't even want to, no, I'm not, like, they don't want to be autistic. And obviously I think from what I see, and that's just from the outside looking in, I think a huge part of fostering positive mental health in an autistic person could be tied up in accepting who they are, understanding their strengths, as well as the things that they might find difficult. And if you've got children that are sort of in that phase of denial, perhaps if we changed that whole process, you wouldn't have that. You'd have kids growing up right off the bat. Oh, that's me, is it? Oh, cool. Okay, that means I'd like this, I do that. That's why this is slightly this way. And, I think it's really important.
Families are told often by schools or, referral services and so on, no, your child's not struggling enough for us to refer them. I'm just going to turn the comments off for myself just because I get distracted. So Sai's going to pay attention to the comments for me. So and now I've lost my train of thought. Oh no. Oh yeah. So, families are often told, oh no, they're doing okay, they're doing well, they're academically okay, and all this kind of thing. And that actually might be the case. They might actually have relatively good mental well-being and self-esteem, but the family have recognized that they're autistic. And so a lot of the time it's not even necessarily to get support, which I think a lot of schools, maybe they kind of don't want to be inundated, I guess, with loads of autistic children being recognized as autistic, because then they think, oh, that means we're going to have to spread our very thin resources even thinner. But a lot of the time it's mostly to help that young person recognize that they do experience the world differently, and that is really important. It's like hiding somebody's cultural background, or like any identity that you can possibly think of that's important for people, and will shape how they experience life and the world. And I don't mean in a negative way. It might be in a fine, great, neutral way. Like, it doesn't have to be all singing, all dancing, and it also doesn't have to be all sad and doom and gloom. It could just be, oh, right, I get that. That helps me understand how I experience the world. Maybe we can adjust our communication around that young person. It doesn't necessarily have to be masses of resources that go into change per se. Weird tangent.
No, it's a good one. I like tangents. I live on a tangent. Um, it seems to me that there's a need for, like you say, the whole sort of process of what it's called at the moment and diagnosis. I mean, is that so? You've got your finger much more on the pulse in terms of autistic academics and research, but who's in charge of that then? Who's in charge of the ADOS, things like that? That's all ICDs, DSMs. I mean, presumably there's not an autistic member of those boards. I don't know. Like, how does that happen? What do we do? Who do we shout at?
It's interesting. I mean, in terms of, although there was a small number within, like a minority within the community that weren't happy about, for instance, Asperger's being removed from the manual. Actually, as much as I don't like the manuals, and they do need to go in the bin, there was a lot of autistic input in the update between the DSM-4 and DSM-5 to make positive change and to remove the sort of unnecessary and arbitrary subtyping of autism, which isn't necessary. Because the more updated version does give a more nuanced picture of how an autistic person might experience the world. Like I say, that's not me saying I like the manuals. I really don't. But there was autistic input there. So what was the question in terms of who has a say in these things?
Yeah, who we shouting at?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, in terms of the APA, so the DSM is an American publication that we use quite readily in the UK. And then we've got the World Health Organization, haven't we? The International Classification of Diseases, which also maps quite closely to the DSM and gets updated officially with the removal of Asperger's next year. So it has been removed, but the official sort of release of the publication, which you can access it now, isn't until next year. So we use the American publication, and that tends to be, when it is updated, it will be lots of sort of symposiums and conferences of people in the areas that they're talking about. So if it is an autistic diagnosis that they're talking about, they'll have a board of people then come together to talk about the updates. They'll look at evidence as well across numerous pieces of research about what autism or how autism is understood at that point in time. The issue with all of that, apart from the positive that there were autistic people having input into the last update, the issue is that they're being drowned out by non-autistic derived autism research. I guess for the UK, I think the more we keep trying to push narrative change, which is happening in different areas actually. So for instance, I'm on a local NHS and council board to try and improve services in Kent. I'm also on a national board about changing the narrative in services across the UK. And so they're both being led by autistic people at different levels of those service changes kind of thing, about changing the narrative. You know, that it's autistic people, we need to be looking at autistic people's mental well-being and stop saying that autistic, services will often reject autistic people who need mental health support because they've experienced trauma and things like this. And they'll be like, oh, we can't help you, it's an autistic thing. And it's like, no, but based on that person's autistic, you need to understand what that means and how that will actually alter how they experience their mental health. But it's still the same mental health concerns that non-autistic people have, but it will just potentially present differently. And then that means you have to adapt your therapy to be able to take on board that autistic person and support their mental well-being. But to dismiss them as being, no, it's just an autistic thing, we can't help. Mostly, I think, is because the services just don't have the knowledge or the resources or the confidence to support autistic people. So there's a lot of push with that. And I keep trying to push those two different boards to allow me, I'll do it for free, to deliver like my talks on autistic well-being. to try and help them understand what therapists are getting wrong. I'm going to come back.
I told you this would happen. If Si's got the power to pin the question, I'm going to get asked about massive arms or massive legs. Oh,
is this in relation to you, Sam? Then that makes more sense now.
I've seen that question a few times now, Chloe, and I think I've skirted it. So I think Si's getting frustrated. I haven't given him an answer. I'm going to go with 20-foot arms because I could reach stuff without getting up. And I could just like hold them in the air or drag them along the ground, which I pretty much do anyway. Look at state of me. Whereas 20-foot legs I'd just be so tall. I'd look like I've just got an image now of me on 20-foot legs banging into stuff and moaning that things are designed for tiny people, even though I've got these ridiculous 20-foot legs. So
exactly. This is what he doesn't understand is he's above average height. So the average height of a male, I think, is still currently only, is it 5'10", I think?
I don't know. You're asking me as if that's the sort of thing I would know.
Okay. I think that's current average height for men in the UK.
So has that gone up? That's gone up.
Potentially. Anyone feel free to find out and Google what's the average height.
Maybe Louis right. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's average height in like 4023 or something. If we carry on the trajectory we're on, we should probably get back to talking about autistic experience, really, shouldn't we? One thing I remember the question I did want to ask was, is there any? Because obviously, evidence-based therapeutic support, even in a neurotypical sense, is pretty wishy-washy depending on what you read, who did the research, all kinds of things. My kind of approach to therapy in general is it's not one size fits all. Different things would work for different people. Some people swear by cold water therapy. Some people are not even getting in a cold bath. You know, it's not going to happen for them, so they're not going to benefit from it. So, is there anything that suggests what is good to be working towards to support an autistic person with their mental health?
Okay, so interestingly, David and I did a joint consult with a fantastic person the other day. And what was interesting about that is they asked a very similar question. So they were asking about what therapies might be best for the person they wanted to support, who was their partner, that was trauma informed, because that was important. To be fair, I think every therapy or any therapy that any human being is seeking should be trauma informed, because I think my perspective, still evidence-based perspective, but it's still my perspective, is that all mental health concerns, anxiety, psychosis, depression, all of them, they're based on experiencing trauma or traumas of some description, and nobody gets to dictate what a trauma is. That's also a problem with the literature. It kind of has a very particular and narrow perspective of what trauma is.
So sorry to interrupt. So could that mean then that all mental health is you put it better. I don't know how you put it now.
A reasonable response to trauma, or a reasonable response to a disordered society.
But two people could go into the same event. So, for example, I go into a room and it's really busy, and everyone sort of jumps and starts singing "Happy Birthday" to me. That's not going to be traumatic for me. I love being in the limelight, but for someone else, that could be hugely traumatizing. Yeah. And so therefore it's our judgment of trauma that's perhaps needs to move.
And in the very limited research that I looked at basically I was having, for my autistic wellbeing what works, I talk specifically about CBT, because CBT is the most used or touted therapy regardless of where you are in the world, pretty much. So I looked at that, and there's very little research at all to demonstrate where people have done a study to see if it works for autistic people in the same way or similar way or better way than for non-autistic people, and even fewer research studies demonstrating where adaptations have been made, which I don't see as real adaptations. I see them as quite superficial adaptations where they don't really understand autistic experience, but they've their idea is, oh, I've got an environment where it's not too sensory overwhelming, for instance. It's kind of like, okay, that's, to me, that's basic. That's not an adaptation to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not an adaptation. It's a what's the word? Basic requisite, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, even if they're not autistic, to be fair. I've lost my train of thought. Hold on. What was your question?
Well, you were answering it. I mean, it was kind of what is there any evidence for what kind of is
right?
most
Yes.
for
Thank you. That helps. Gets my thought process back because of my thinking in pictures. Yeah. So when I was looking, there is very little to demonstrate that, for instance, CBT works. And given how that CBT has the most research or papers or studies on it compared to any other therapy, that's quite concerning, because what I did find was very limited, which means other therapies that might potentially work for autistic people better, there's next to no research to demonstrate that either. So what's my point? Okay, so
yeah.
Say it one more time. So what might work best for us? Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, is there anything kind of research based, or you know, with a large group of autistic people that have been asked what's helped? Okay.
No.
And
basically,
okay,
no.
And because I'm thinking of all the studies of, you know, because at the moment, obviously, lots of studies show, unfortunately, a very real challenge for autistic adults to feel happy in their adulthood, as far as I'm aware. So I'm interested in those stories of success. What's helped someone get to a point where they feel they are in a happy, successful place?
Yeah. So when I was looking at CBT, like I say specifically, the only study that kind of stood out for me. Why am I echoing? Help. The only study that stood out for me was a group-based CBT with autistic people. Now that would sound like a nightmare, because we tend to not like to be in groups, but it seemed to, although I would say not any better than anything else, improve like the rates of depression for that autistic group who did the group-based CBT. But what I highlighted when I was reading it, and then what the researchers or the authors kind of made like a very small comment about towards the end, is, was it CBT that improved their well-being, or being with other autistic people? And I would argue, which I have done for several years, is that if you can have small, safe spaces where you can teach autistic people what it means to be autistic from autistic experience, not from, you know, non-autistic autism researchers or practitioners or what have you, and give them the structure and the safe space to connect with one another and feel validated. So you brought up trauma. We were talking about trauma, and I was saying that, yes, you're quite right. So there is actually some. Why am I echoing? Help. I'm just going to put you on mute just for a second in case is it my end? Oh, it might be your end. Okay, I'll bring you. You can unmute yourself if that's okay in a second, just because it's echoing, it's distracting. So there is a bit of work or a bit of discussion. I think one paper by Griffiths et al. In 2019 on how things that non-autistic people might class as traumatic, we might not necessarily find traumatic or experience as a trauma, and vice versa. So like you said, overwhelming environments and things can actually be incredibly traumatic, to the extent that it will create like post-traumatic stress responses. The other sorts of traumas that I see are fantastic young people and autistic adults who've been restrained, and they have post-traumatic stress responses from those experiences, quite rightly. Invalidation trauma, so the constantly being told, particularly when you're young and people haven't realised you're autistic, you know, it's loud, it's loud. It's like, no, it's not. What are you talking about? It's fine in here, you know. And those constant little tiny invalidations throughout your childhood and adulthood is invalidation trauma, and that really can have a cumulative traumatic impact on you. So yeah, trauma informed is really important, but the therapist needs to understand what trauma might be for an autistic person, because it, like I say, it might not look or be the same for non-autistic people, and B, what that trauma response might look like, because it might not look, the therapist might be expecting certain behavioural responses if they're expecting some they're trying to support somebody who says they've experienced trauma and they're expecting a certain behavioural response. That's not going to work if you've got an autistic person who doesn't show outwardly that they're distressed. So, having a neutral autistic face, potentially not crying in front of other people or at all. So the therapist might think, well, they're not going through trauma or not experienced trauma, but they're not recognising that we will, at baseline as autistic people, respond differently. It's like I fell asleep pretty much when I had my tattoo done because I respond differently to pain. So to outsiders, that looks like I wasn't in pain, but it's still painful, kind of thing.
I just realised I'm on mute.
I've unmuted.
I'm there going, meaningless.
I just want to quickly address Julia Harris.
Sure. Acceptance
and commitment therapy. You'll have to remind me. I can certainly have a look and see if there's any literature on ACT with autistic people. To some extent, I kind of like some of the premise of acceptance and commitment therapy. The only issue I would have with anything like that and CBT or any therapy is assuming that, for instance, so an autistic person goes to therapy for anxiety, and a CBT therapist will assume or work on the premise that that autistic person has faulty thinking. Their anxiety is based on A happened and that person went to, I don't know, Acorn as opposed to B, right? And responded in an incorrect way. And so their cognition is wrong, which means their behavioural response is wrong, in quotation marks. But autistic anxiety, a lot of the time, but not always, is based on reality. It's based on overwhelm of the sensory and social environment. So you can't therapize away my anxiety, but I can develop and learn skills, largely taught by myself to myself, and also by connecting with the autistic community who've learnt and then shared that information of how to deal with the environment. So, a therapist might try and get somebody to desensitize to noise. You can't do that with autistic people. There's evidence that the pain receptors in our brain light up when we are in sensory overwhelm and distress. You can't therapize or desensitize that experience. Now I've lost the train of thought from the beginning. Oh, acceptance and commitment therapy. So yes, the issue with ACT, I guess, would be dependent on what the client or however you want to describe the autistic person in the therapy setting, what they want out of it and what the therapist thinks that they are trying to help that person do. I don't necessarily know that accepting the situation that we might be in, which is a disordered society, is necessarily helpful per se.
And also, there's so many, I think, examples certainly that I've found over the years where your assumption that a therapeutic model that suits or works for and it's not always even a majority, but works for a majority of neurotypical people is experienced so differently by an autistic person. So for example, talking therapies and times where you kind of relive the experience. I've done work with children, young people, where it's very obvious that even just thinking about that traumatic event again, they're just not ready for that. And there's no amount of me forcing them through it or dressing it up as a different activity, or it's just not going to be helpful to them, because it will just, I had a young man tell me once, it's like I am back there, I'm literally back there. And I think, and I'm, I'm going to label myself as neurotypical. I know that's been questioned in various forums, but I also wanted to pick up on the invalidation trauma, and it was something I was talking to, I think it was Tigger or someone the other day, but that actually sometimes as neurotypical professionals and parents, we will have to accept that there is a strong likelihood that without perhaps meaning to, we have caused trauma to our children and young people through that invalidation. And it's not saying you're a bad, evil parent, it's just understanding that double empathy, understanding that clash, because again, it takes my brain longer to empathize and think, actually, maybe they're really struggling with that, because I wouldn't struggle with that, and no one else I know would struggle with that. So they're overdoing
it. And this is where you do tend, the autistic community, we're a very varied bunch. We're very diverse. And some of us aren't necessarily as in tune or self-aware of our own needs, let alone necessarily other people's. There's no judgment on that. It's just differences across our community. But some of us might be incredibly in tune and worked those things out. And I always give different examples of when I meet new autistic people, more so when we were offline, and picking up on things that maybe non-autistic people wouldn't pick up on. So I remember meeting a new autistic person, and they looked relatively uncomfortable, kind of stiff, which might be their go-to. That might be just how they inhabit the world. And I thought, oh, I picked up on it, and I was like, here, have an object, let's concentrate on something else, and other than the fact that you're meeting new people that you don't know. And I don't know how in tune non-autistic people would have been to that person's, just like I say, it wasn't a very outward obvious demonstration of this is a new environment and I'm uncomfortable, because they looked relatively neutral, I guess. But autistic people, we can pick up on that with other autistic people. Some other things, because you were asking, well, I think originally you were kind of asking, well, what therapy then might work? What? And the problem with that, which you've already alluded to, is that it's all personal to the individual, whether you're autistic or not. And really importantly, so going back to, like, say, we had this fantastic consult with this lovely person, and they asked that because we'd said it needs to be trauma informed, etc., etc. And they said, do you have any suggestions? I said, the issue with that is you have to work out how that autistic person experiences being autistic. So the reason I say that, so we were talking about, well, would EMDR, so eye movement desensitization reprogramming, I can't remember what it stands for.
Yeah, something like that.
I can't remember. So if anybody remembers, feel free to pop it in the chat box, because I've completely forgotten. I always just call it EMDR because then I know what I mean. But so that EMDR thing is based on, basically reliving the trauma with a therapist, and then the eye movement. It's very interesting. It sounds like woo, but it seems to work for people. It's about the eye movement and like it says, reprogramming how you respond to those thoughts and feelings of the trauma that you've experienced. Now, importantly, that will not work for an autistic person who doesn't think in pictures. So the issue is, it's not sufficient to say, oh, we've developed a CBT that we've adapted for autistic people, because I would go, what kind of autistic person? Now, I don't mean subtypes, because that's in the bin. We're not talking about subtypes. We're talking about the very, like all human beings, complex autistic person. So we're more likely, most human beings, generally speaking, think in pictures to some extent as they're processing, right? In the autistic community, as always, there's extremes. You have aphants who can't think in pictures at all, even if they try. So aphantasia is the inability to mentally think in pictures, even if they're trying. And then you've got the opposite, which is hyperphants, like myself, who constantly are thinking in pictures, which is why I also get distracted, because my brain's thinking in those pictures, and then I go off on tangents and my mouth hasn't caught up with what I was actually thinking. And that's why I'm always looking off, because pictures are there. I also can think in sound and words and sometimes touch and things like that. So you can see you've got just that one difference between two autistic people will mean that numerous therapies will either not work or work better. So CBT, most therapies actually, a lot of therapies, particularly mindfulness and things like that, use imagination techniques. How are you going to do that with somebody who can't think in pictures? Does the autistic person that's in front of you, in your therapy chair, experience alexithymia? So they struggle to recognize, articulate, or experience emotions. That's not that they're emotionless, but they struggle to connect abstract ideas of emotions with what they're experiencing or the situation and things like that. And interestingly, alexithymia seems to be greater for those who also don't think in pictures. So there's a connection. So that's what I ask now. So I'm not a therapist, I'm not that kind of doctor, but I do a very small number of consults with autistic people to work out their well-being concerns, so I can signpost them to different things, different information and stuff like that. One of the very first things I would want to ask in that consult is, do you think in pictures? No, they don't. Okay, it's likely then that you also struggle with emotions and recognizing them. They go, yes, I do. And, so you start to work with, okay, that means I can't ask you, which I wouldn't anyway, how are you feeling? How's your day been? Because that actually typically means, by a non-autistic person, how you're feeling, very annoyingly. Whereas an autistic person who thinks in pictures like me will go to that question, how's your day been? I go, oh, right. Took me a while to get out of bed. I'm imagining myself in bed right now. And then I did this. And then what bit do they need to know? Do they need to know all of it? And that's exhausting. If you ask an autistic person who doesn't think in pictures, how's your day been or how you're feeling, they kind of go blank because they don't know. There's nothing for them to process to give you. So I tend to work on with the AFANTs and those with alexithymia. I won't ask them how are you doing or anything. I just ask what's happened to you this week, and we work on the concrete and the logical. So you can see how a question that seems straightforward, what therapy might work for autistic people, is not straightforward at all.
Well, I'm pleased in some ways because it ties into my idea of what therapy works for any person. There's no definitive. I think what's coming through loud and clear though is that the person delivering the therapeutic practice has to have a really deep understanding of not just autistic experience, but that person they're working with autistic experience, and that might be a better road to go down if you are someone who delivers some sort of therapy that wants to work with, say, autistic children or autistic adults. Then you need to start thinking about how do you understand their experience in the first however many sessions.
What is their personal neurological and cognitive and psychological sort of makeup, if you like? And that's a little bit of investigating, because like I say, not all autistic people know their own needs and experiences, and particularly if they don't think in pictures and are alexithymic, they do very much struggle with that, working out what their needs are. So you kind of have to help support that and work those things out. I'm echoing again, hold on. And then I lose my train of thought, hold on. So yeah, it's important to work out, sorry, I muted, you can unmute if you want to. So yeah, it's important to work out multiple things. Is the person, so again, with the small number of consults I do, I will work out, is the person in front of me communicating in a purely autistic way, in quotation marks, or are they communicating in an autistic and attention differences way, because they're different. People with attention differences tend to go about the houses, and there's no judgment here, it's just how they communicate. So they go about the houses and they kind of don't have a breath for like maybe 20 minutes. So I just kind of let them know, I'm just going to make notes while you talk. And then when they do have a breath, I'll go, right, the thing you said 10 minutes ago, can we go back to that? right? If it's an autistic person and they don't have attention differences, they'll probably monologue and then but there'll also be the opportunity to back and forth, but it's like big back and forth, if that makes sense, as opposed to non-autistic little back and forth, right? So you can see the real differences here. So some autistic people, again, with attention differences, will talk quite fast. So again, just picking up and making sure you're not interrupting them, because they'll lose the flow and things like that, which is why it's better to make notes. I've communicated with autistic people who take longer to process information. That's not the same as being slow. So some people will see it that because you ask them a question and you can almost see the cogs turning, and then I just sit back and wait, and then they'll answer. A lot of people will see that as they're slow, in quotation marks, to process, but it's not that at all. It's that they're processing so much information that it takes them longer, and that's not the same as being slow. So you just have to have that sort of just sitting back, and it just takes that little bit longer for the conversation back and forth. Again, no judgment there. It's just how they're processing. So yeah, there's so many multiple things. It's communication. It's like, how do they think in pictures? Do they struggle to recognize their own needs? And do they have interoception issues as well? Like not recognizing if they don't recognize when they need the bathroom and that they're thirsty, there's that connection, and more likely that they also struggle with alexithymia. And then you can work on, okay, do you think in pictures? So you can see how all these things would build up then. That's really what any therapist or anybody who's trying to support an autistic person wants to do, is build up that picture of how that autistic person inhabits the world, interacts with it and understands it. And then you can start working on, okay, let's talk about trauma, or not, or deal with it in this way. And you see it everywhere. You see it in, so I was sitting in on so it was like TAs and Senkos, I think, talking about a specialist school, autistic school, or autism school rather. And they were talking about how they were going to bring in the zones of regulation. Can you explain the zones of regulation? I know a little bit about it, enough to be frustrated with it.
Yeah, it is frustrating actually. So basically, it's categorizing. It's a bit like the 5-point scale of anger. It's categorizing emotions into sort of colors. And I think the zones of regulation, I think, is green, yellow, red, and blue. And I think green is obviously like happy, excited. I think red, I can't remember. I think blue is like not happy but just calm. So it's one of those things where you kind of you're explaining to someone emotions in a rigid way in the hope that will help their understanding, but actually it's just confusing because that isn't what emotions are like anyway. So yeah,
so the little bit that I've just explained about the mix and match of possible cognitive styles and things like that, you can see why the zones of regulation, if you did that as a blanket thing for all autistic people in either a mainstream school, but with an autistic, like, I don't know, what do they call it? Like centre, or what do they call them? Mainstream school that has like an autism, what is it?
Like a specialist school, SEN unit, or
no, I was saying like mainstream schools that have an autism unit or something.
They don't tend to. They would tend to have a Senko, and they'll have like they'll have a room or somewhere. They might have a sensory room, maybe. Yeah. But most mainstream schools just got like a nurture space.
Yeah. So if you've got, okay, this was pretend it's an autism specialist school and they're all autistic, and it's not a mainstream school then, and the school decides to try and roll out the zones of regulation for all autistic people, you can see where if those who really struggle with alexithymia, those who don't think in pictures, and so on and so forth, that's probably not necessarily going to work for them, and it's going to make them either frustrated or it's literally just not going to work. So this is the thing of people thinking that autism is just this very narrow stereotype. We're starting to very, very slowly get toward the idea that autism isn't gendered, that autistic people can be of any gender and any sexuality, but we still potentially are stuck. I don't mean us, I mean like the hypothetical we, we're still stuck in this idea that ignores, like say, those things that I now class as basic: thinking in pictures, alexithymia, communication style, multiple things.
A couple of things to just pick back on. First of all, Simon pinned up "Do they, Chloe?" whilst you were, I think, doing the thing that you were explaining that certain people do, which is quite funny. You were talking. I think you were talking about monologuing.
Oh,
he put "Do they, Chloe?" So that was funny.
We do.
But also, oh no, I've lost my train of thought. Okay. Well, there was another one that was pinned up with by Samara, that could it be that parents or carers of autistic children are looking for a quick fix and therefore don't allow the time? I think 100%. I mean, you know, as someone that's tried to deliver that kind of support to children and young people since sort of 2013, we now say to our funders, look, you know, we need at least, say, like 12 sessions to even get near an outcome with a young person, because it might take me 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to even get them feeling comfortable with me, or me understanding how to adjust so that they do feel comfortable with me, or, you know, all of those kind of things that take so much time.
And there's multiple factors involved in that. There's masking, so it takes a long time to even realise that they're masked, which particularly young people might not recognise. To allow themselves to feel safe to be authentically themselves will take time. The processing will take time, you know, because they're trying to process multiple things. Sensory issues, you're a new person, like there's multiple things that means it does take longer. So our So You're Autistic program originally was 6 sessions of 2 hours each, and the evaluation was always, it needs to be longer, so it's now 8. I mean, to be fair, I think they would always say it needs to be longer. We could get to like 100 sessions and they still like say it needs to be longer. But part of that, the first sort of 4 or 5 sessions is very structured to allow for them not to feel that the onus is on them to talk or contribute in some capacity, and to get them comfortable and just learn what I class as the basics, in quotation marks, of what is autistic experience, so that they can move away from the sort of deep from the pathology. But that takes so much time, and sometimes we do have students that go through the program twice because they only realised towards the end how to drop their mask, if you like. So they want to go through it again without heavily masking, so that they can benefit better from it. So it can take time.
Another thing that struck me, actually, that I think might be an error that would need addressing for, I guess. So a lot of things that are supposed to be therapeutic for the autistic person, particularly child or young person, in my experience, they then sort of change what the meaning of therapeutic is, because therapeutic is supposed to leave you feeling better. Whereas it's not supposed to change, you know, if a child goes to someone for therapeutic support and they're being taught appropriate social skills, that's not therapy. That's trying to change them. It's teaching. It's, you know.
Yeah, so therapy, like you say, quite rightly, therapy should be for the benefit of the person receiving the therapy, not for the people around the person receiving therapy. It's not about others and how they interact or behave necessarily towards other people. It's about, am I unhappy? If I'm unhappy, why am I unhappy? And how do what needs to change for that to be, for me to be able to be happy? And it might not be that it's anything to do with that person changing at all. It might be, actually, everything around me is making me unhappy because of sensory overwhelm, social expectations, people invalidating me constantly. So like I say, what I really do strongly argue is good for our well-being, regardless of what mental health concerns an autistic person might have. So obviously if they are experiencing something that needs quite good, really specific support like psychosis and things like that, but there's still not to say that alongside that autistic person could probably also do with being around other autistic people who validate them and actually like their authentic selves. So a lot of the time, like I say, in our groups, they're very small groups. We never have more than 8 usually in a group with 2 practitioners. And then what you see, like I say, when we look at the evaluations, they might mention a bit about the education that we give them, because it is quite education heavy towards the beginning, like say, to structure it. But the education really is just a means of structuring. It's not so that we're not just throwing a bunch of autistic people together and going, talk about what it means to be autistic, talk about your issues. We can't do that. That sounds horrendous to me. So in the evaluations, it's not about the education. What you hear is, I was isolated before and now I'm not alone. I thought I've literally got some lovely anonymous evaluations from students saying things like, I thought I could be autistic by myself, and I realised that actually I'm better around other autistic people, or they blamed autism, like it's poor autism's fault for their struggles in the world, when actually it's not. It's how people treat them because of being autistic. It's not poor autism's fault. We need to be kinder to autism. Autism isn't a separate thing, but this is kind of how I'm trying to talk to some of our students who do blame their autism, if you like, for being unhappy. And it's kind of like, really what they're doing is they're blaming themselves, because autism isn't a separate thing. But if that's the way they're wording it, I kind of go with that to try and say to them, but it's not poor autism's fault. Autism hasn't done anything wrong. Autism is just being, it's people around who are being mean to poor autism, i.e. you, because they are struggling to realise that really what they're doing is blaming themselves, and it's not their fault. They're fantastic people. I still yet to meet through our student groups an autistic person who I think is not very nice, or I think they're just fantastic people. And it's just really lovely just to see them go, oh, but I thought I was the only one who did that, or but I thought everyone does that, and then it's actually the opposites of both. And just feeling validated when we go for ourselves. Annette and I, we kind of strike a balance between bringing ourselves into, sorry, just in the comment on the page, we try and strike a balance between bringing ourselves in to show them that we can connect with them, and also trying to obviously not bring too much of ourselves in, because it's not about us. But we try and bring that in. Like I'll say, I have to have my naps in the afternoon because I get burnt out really quickly and things like this, and showing them that stuff's okay, and things like that. So some of that is enough for some of our lovely autistic students who some of them come in with really incredibly low self-esteem and really poor well-being. So yeah, identity, culture, community, and space.
100%. And that's such a big part of it, and it's inspiring that people such as yourself are bringing that together. It does, to me, I feel like I'm maybe my role can be targeting the other end of it, which is just getting people to stop being so ignorant and invalidating people and making them feel excluded just because they don't do things quite the same as everyone else. Because maybe then there wouldn't be as big a need for feeling like you found your group of people, because as a society and a culture and a species, I would hope that one day we can get to a point where that doesn't need to happen, because that's everyone. That's everyone. Yes, you might gravitate towards people that like to communicate in a similar way to you, but you won't feel threatened and stigmatized,
isolated, and minoritized. I do have that at the end of lots of my training. Actually, I do like a quick summary breakdown about autistic experience isn't disorder or broken, and this, that, and the other. So I like my summary, and then part of that is to say that for now, what really needs to change is not autistic people, it's the environment, and that also includes people in our environment, so you know, society and so on. Until that happens, we have to come together to connect with other autistic people. So yeah, so that's what I say. Until then, until the environment changes and society changes, it's really important for our well-being and our self-esteem and so on to come together and find other autistic people.
Which is why in schools we need social skills training for not autistic children, for all children, to say, oh, you know, that's fine, you're different, it's all right.
I mean, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it is kind of sadly true at the same time, which is that non-autistic people, neurotypical people, they're very rigid and black and white in their thinking, and you know, so they do really struggle to understand that we do have a language and communication, a functional communication of our own, which Rachel Cullen talked about on Aucademy, which is fascinating and based in or from her linguistics degree, that we're not like little islands that have our own autistic way of understanding and communicating the world. We have a shared way of communicating at sort of like linguistic level. And I was thinking about this day, it's odd. It is almost like, not all obviously, but a lot of non-autistic people assume that every single autistic person is just either communicationless or their communication is so different at individual level. But it's not. Like I said, we do have a shared functional language. So I do recommend anybody to watch Rachel Cullen's video on that. It really helps to understand why your autistic person, if you're not autistic yourself, what literal actually means, because people think they know what being literal means and they really don't. And Rachel kind of explains that communication so that people can understand that a bit better.
Fascinating. Thank you, as always. I've learned so much in just an hour, so always enjoy talking to you.
Because we are going to disappear, I just want to quickly, because there was a couple of things, I don't want to answer them per se because we won't have time. Somebody, I'm not going to tag it if you like on the screen, but the person who was talking about supporting somebody with psychosis. So I don't know if you've looked at anything, videos or written pieces by David Gray Hammond on Aucademy. He's very openly talked about his experiences with psychosis, so he's very, you know, he's great and very, very useful to talk about that. And they're saying many therapists and doctors will not recognize her psychosis because she's too lucid, in quotation marks. So yes, autistic people, this just another highlighting that because of being autistic, that will impact the presentation of other mental health concerns. Not that autistic is a mental health concern, but it will impact how mental health concerns are experienced and displayed. So David himself was told that he couldn't be diagnosed with anything because he didn't present in a typical way with psychosis. My friend Jessica, the same thing, was told we can't diagnose you with anything because you don't present in the typical way with psychosis. Doesn't change the fact that they do experience auditory and or visual and or olfactory, so smelling hallucinations and things like that. So yeah, that's a very common frustrating thing for autistic people. But yeah, definitely.
Let's do this again, Chloe. If you'll have.
Oh yeah, I love Sam questions, because I'm very used to, obviously nobody invites me on anything. So I'm very used to you know, I love interviewing all the different autistic people for Aucademy and things, but it means I don't often get the chance for people to ask me questions, which is quite nice.
Oh well, I'll ask you questions anytime you like, so just let me know.
Fantastic, lovely. I'm going to play my snazzy outro music.
Ooh, so like this in the background.
Yes, we can, but nobody will see you, so it's just for you.
Okay, I'll do it now.
No, that's like, that's just like an indication. Just imagine Sam doing that in the background
with my glorious beard. That's all it'll show.
Bye, everybody.